Okay, right on. Hello, Ignacio.
Hi
Welcome,
there.
Chris. Hey, Alex. Looks like Brett I saw there too. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Thanks so much for joining us. Hey, Chris, there you are. Awesome, guys. And here's Brett. We got a couple people just kind of trickling in here, so I'll try to keep an eye on the front door, so to speak, and make sure we're letting people in as they show up. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here, you guys. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And today I have the distinct pleasure of hosting Mr. Rick George. So thanks so much for being here, Rick.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Matt, for inviting me to this to your forum here, your opportunity to talk about and share about different elements of, I think, what are general conversations around mental health. I'm assuming broadly. So glad to be here to talk and share and hear your guys' views.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you guys, before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Rick. And, I've had the absolute pleasure of knowing Rick personally for a number of years now because Rick is actually my father-in-law. And as some of you guys know, I've recently faced some challenges with addiction and sobriety. And in the last 4 years have found sobriety in large part because of the support and the encouragement of Rick. And I just wanted to take a moment to, I'm sure that I've said this in the past, but to publicly acknowledge you and say thank you again for the help, the encouragement, and the support that you provided back then, because that has been, invaluable, not only to myself, but also to my family. And so I've really benefited from my time with Rick and the wisdom and the experience that he shared. And my hope is that we can impart a small amount of that wisdom here today through dialogue and discussion. So thank you again, Rick. I certainly appreciate you, my friend.
Well, thanks for saying that, Matt. It has been a great journey that I've enjoyed with you, working alongside you, and so it's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, just as far as the conversation goes today, guys, I felt inclined to maybe just share a little bit of a disclaimer, maybe for liability's sake and that sort of thing. But, the purposes of today's call is meant to be more about community, connection, and general dialogue and discussion. And it's not intended to be taken as specific, advice. Although Rick is a licensed professional, if there's something specific that you're struggling with, I feel inclined to suggest that you reach out to either a medical professional in your region and seek out specific advice and support as far as that's concerned. But just given the kind of climate that we live in today, I felt inclined to just share that. So Rick and I were having a conversation just prior to you guys all logging on here, and we agreed that if there are any specific questions or if there are other things that you guys would like to bring to the table as far as conversation topics or things that you'd like to get out of the conversation today, feel free to unmute yourself and throw it out there or pop a question in the chat, and we'll do our best to address all of that. Sound cool, guys?
Okay,
Beautiful.
great.
Right on.
And I'm assuming, Matt, you'll kind of keep an eye on the chat.
I will.
I can see it from here, but I'd have to get really close to see it. So you'll keep an eye on that if that comes up for us. Okay,
absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for those of you who don't know, Rick has been a licensed professional psychotherapist for over 38 years and is currently residing in Florida and working and helping clients remotely through telehealth. And is that correct, Rick?
It is correct. Yeah. There's a slight disclaimer in there, though. I've really only been a psychotherapist for about 7 years because the majority of my career I've administered and directed programs where other people got to do that work. And so a lot of it was more at a higher level. And just over the last 2.5 years, I came back to direct service at the end of my as I got into semi-retirement. So that's
Okay.
more specific. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
out of curiosity, Rick, what are some of the like main things or some of the most common things that people reach out to you for when they're looking to receive treatment or therapy? Is it, you know, stress, anxiety, depression, addiction, or just kind of the pressures of life in general? What are some of the most common things that you tend to see and deal with?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I work on a platform that has a very high volume of people that seek services. The system's called BetterHelp, and I don't know if it operates in Canada at this point, but it certainly operates significantly through the U.S. Um, I'll give you just a couple of generalities around it. The majority of people who seek my services, and I have a profile that's in the system, so people can select to me or they also suggest me for various people based on what they're asking for. The majority of people who seek my services are men. They're usually between 20 and 35 years old. I have a handful of women that I work with. Um, a great deal of about half of the people I work with have never sought any kind of psychotherapy services before, but quite a few of them have had experiences in the past. And almost all of them have had a positive experience in one way or the other, even though they may not have stuck with it for very long. They have a general view of it as a worthwhile endeavor. Um, the format I'm able to do it by phone, video, and even by chat function. And I have a couple of clients that I work with by chat, although it's quite a bit slower process. It still is an effective one, and I'm kind of amazed at how much progress both of these gentlemen make just by doing it through chat. The majority of people I work with by phone. Regarding the kinds of things that they come to me with, it's pretty wide spectrum of issues. Um, I have people who come to me specifically with career issues because one of my strength areas is strategic planning and career development kinds of stuff. So I have a small group of people that are trying to figure out, should I change jobs? Should I get training for a new career? Should I do, what can I make it in this job? Is there something about me that's causing me to have trouble with this job, or do I need to make a shift? And so there's problem solving and sort of exploration around that sort of thing. I'd say the majority of people I work with, it's a relationship issue of some sort. Sometimes it's a very difficult past family relationship or a current father or mother relationship situation that people are dealing with. Um, uh, Several people I work with are dealing with a recent breakup and are not handling it well and realizing that they're not recovering from it very quickly or easily and are looking for some ways to manage to that. And then there's another group of people who really fall into the category of they're recognized finally or admitting that they have depression,
Mm,
and that they're suffering from depression. It's holding them back, and they're wondering what to do about it. They may have tried some various sources. And the second part of that is anxiety. And some folks both have anxiety and depression as major issues. Sometimes panic attacks are a part of the dynamic, and they're looking for resources or a solution that they either have not been able to find on their own so far, or have tried a number of things, and this is the sort of the direction that they're going.
right.
Most of the people I work with for between 10 and maybe 15 sessions, but I also have clients I've worked with for more than a year. And usually what we transition to after we do some problem solving around various symptoms is we move toward, looking more deeply at their history and how their history is playing a vital role in their functioning and limitations in the way in which they operate. Um, so that's kind of an overview.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a variety of different either subject matters and challenges that people facing everything from career to relationships to family. And I don't know about you guys, but those are
Yes.
all things that I can absolutely relate to when it comes to the challenges of everyday life. you know? And I'd certainly like to come back to this conversation about specifically anxiety and depression, because I think that that's one of the things that is very prevalent in today's day and age. But before we get there, I'd like to ask you, Rick, I'm under the impression, and I could be wrong here, but I'm under the impression that either consciously or unconsciously, men specifically have historically been taught to think that we should, kind of do things on our own or figure it out as we go. And I don't know if that's necessarily been your experience, but I have a two-part question here. And my first question is, would you agree with that assessment in general that most men are probably reluctant to reach out and to ask for support? And two, do you feel like having access to things like better health and telehealth and being able to access support via text or the telephone makes it more likely that men will reach out specifically and ask for support, just because there's a little bit of that? It's a little bit either more anonymous or less personal, or that aspect of it. What would your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Well, I would say certainly the generation before us, that there's a lot more reluctance in that group, and a real bias and sort of reluctance to sort of admit wrong, admit that you're in trouble, admit depression or anxiety and those kinds of things. I have to say that I think the generation that we're in now, this current generation, is more receptive to that than they certainly were in the past. And so there is some, I feel more positive about that than I certainly have in the generation before me. And so there is some of that going on that I think really exists. I have a number of clients that I've never actually seen face to face, and I think that it's interesting in the dynamic of that. We start on the phone and we stay on the phone. Some clients like to see me, and I like to see them. They do a video, but they quickly move to phone because it's just more convenient. But I think the anonymity of the phone is a bit comforting to some of our folks. And I know that both of the people I do chat with, anonymity is a part of why they choose that methodology. And so there's a bit of comfort. It gives them a little bit more courage, I think, to move in and talk about those sort of things. Regarding, social media and various things like that, I also, just a note, I have several clients who use apps to assist them with their mental health. And there's quite a number of them out there that are available now. Some of them, accountability systems that are very helpful. I didn't mention, I have several clients who are dealing with pornography. And so they're using things like apps to assist them with accountability. People with an alcohol or drug addiction are using apps to help with accountability kind of structures and reminders or motivational pieces. And they use that as an adjunct to our work together. But to kind of go into a little bit deeper about this issue of social media, social media is creating a lot of, I think, tension and difficulty for a number of people that I work with. Particularly people dealing with pornography, social media, and all of the opportunities to sort of escape into various things through social media creates more difficulty for them. And those who are most successful, I've found so far in dealing with pornography, also really remove themselves from a lot of the social media sort of elements of their life. So it's playing a pretty big role in a number of ways. So,
it's interesting that you bring that up about social media and pornography specifically. And I wonder, maybe after this call, if there are certain apps that you are aware of that you wouldn't mind sharing, I can share that with the community. I know specifically that there are a couple of apps that a friend of mine has used. One is called Sober Buddy, I believe, and it provides little daily prompts and accountability aspects that support sobriety. And I'd be interested to know if there are similar ones when it comes to other things like either social media or porn specifically.
Rick, Chris here, I got a question for you. Back to a comment you made just about the generation before us was a little less maybe open in reaching out for, help or guidance or, kind of that compared to the current generation we're in now. Do you find that social media has a big impact on that kind of aspect due to the fact that let's just say back in the day in the 80s and 90s, we didn't have social media. Heck, we didn't have the internet until 95. So I think a lot of it is negatively portrayed, and I believe filters should be a little bit more regulated on what comes across our social media, almost like a child setting on your computer for your kids to get into YouTube or anything like that. Do you find that that's more the path that people are not setting boundaries for, and it's just an open free for all, and it kind of contaminates the mind?
I think you're making a really solid argument along that line. I think it is true. The amount of social media that people are participating in, the ways in which it's a sort of a free and open market to influence you, to trigger you, to a number of people I'm dealing with struggle with the issue of whether they're getting attention on social media. A couple of the 2 or 3 of the people I work with are kind of in the internet world, and so how many likes they get and how much attention they're getting through the system really plays a heavy role in whether or not they feel okay or not. And there's something kind of bizarre about that when you step back about it. You get this abstract, construct of, I've got 500 likes for my last post on what I ate for dinner last night, and somehow that matters in the world in which we live, and so it's a triggering element that they recognize, but they have a lot of difficulty sort of coming to grips with fully and disengaging from it, because I don't really think there's a really easy way to engage in it and expect that you're going to have good positive outcomes when you're so focused in on whether or not you're getting approval or disapproval through your action. I have a guy who recently opened up, he just opened up a new business, and it had a potential to be really successful, but the social media construct just slammed him and his business, and he went into a deep depression because of the comments that he was getting about his business concept. And so, it's a very challenging area that we don't really have a great solution to yet, and the regulatory structures around it don't really exist yet. I mean, the social media companies aren't being held accountable in a way to create benchmarks or barriers to the damage that's being done to the general public yet. So,
Oh, Chris, you're still muted there, Chris.
Sorry, I recently just started working with Matt, and I've done a lot of self-reflection since meeting Matt and starting things. And some of the things that I've just done on my own is, you get this little survey on your phone once a week of how much time you've been on your phone or what you've kind of been doing. And I've really filtered myself into getting rid of a lot of negative aspects that the social media portrays, and really focusing more on the positive aspects, the reality of positive thinking, the healthness, positive cooking subjects. And in a short period of time, I feel better, I act better, I have a better understanding of who I am, but my phone usage has dropped on average in the last, I'd say 6 weeks, an hour and a half a week, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a steady decline, and I'm feeling better. So the further I get away from the social media and the negative portrays of certain aspects, the better we feel. Am I
you're making a
imagining
very,
this, or is
very
this
valid
actually
and important point. Yeah,
is this actually taking place, or am I imagining this?
I don't think you're imagining things. I've had several periods where I've completely disengaged from both the social media elements and the news. and taken all of the news apps and all of the social media apps off my device and gone on a sabbatical from that. And I have to say that the overall well-being that I experience when I do that has been significant. But in reality, I never do it for any super long period of time. I've gone 6 months, 8 months at different times. And I currently have a small number of social media apps up and a few news apps up. But, you're also causing me to think maybe it's time for another sabbatical and to see what the experience is of removing that for a period of time and seeing what the impact is. So,
I've read a statistic recently that kind of speaks to that. And I think social media, to a large extent, is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used positively if you're carefully curating your feed and if you're using it consciously. But if you're using it unconsciously or carelessly, like anything, it can probably be harmful and destructive. And I read a statistic recently that I thought was really interesting, and that was that if you watch even 3 minutes, I think the report said, if you watch even 3 minutes of the news, you're 20% more likely to report that you're having a tough day. And part of that reason is because we're so inundated with negativity and chaos and crisis and things like that, that subconsciously it primes our brain to see things and filter things as though things are hard or worse off than maybe they might actually be. And I just thought that was really interesting and maybe worth sharing there.
Yeah.
I see Ignacio has his hand up here. Yes, Ignacio, thanks for being patient.
Thank you. Hi, Rick. I just wanted to ask, building on this conversation about access to information, I remember that yesterday I was listening to Mark Manson's podcast. He's the author of the book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Anyways, he was interviewing a mental health expert yesterday on his podcast, and they were discussing the fact of how nowadays in society we have such an incredible amount of exposure and access to mental health, say counselors, psychologists for both adults and children, and yet it seems we have the biggest mental health crisis at the same time. So I wanted to ask you, Rick, what are your thoughts on that? And also, from a selfish perspective, like someone who is actively looking for counseling or psychologist, how can I make sure that I find perhaps a specialist that can help me plan ahead and will actually benefit from me, benefit me rather than perhaps creating more chaos in my mind, if that makes sense?
Yes, yeah. Those are good thoughts, a good thought and a good question. And I've actually been digging deeper into this issue of what you would consider to be the success rates and the overall impact of both mental health and substance abuse types of treatment activities. And I want to, I don't want to be too negative about this, but I also want to be honest about it, is that it's a very, very inexact science. And the overarching impact of good mental health services has a great deal to do with the intrinsic motivation of the person to want to change, to move forward with recognizing that they have something significantly wrong that they'd like to work through and work from, that something's holding them back in some ways. And that, when I look at my recent work over the last couple of years, a great deal of the people that I feel really good about the work that we did together, they took a significant amount of sort of leadership of what was happening in our conversation. And I simply guided and sort of suggested things along the way that sort of slightly redirected that activity or supported it or called out maybe, hey, let's look at a different alternative to way to think about that. But then that there was this intrinsic high level of motivation for change that existed in a person. And And the inverse of that is also true. And I, as I speak about it, you know, people who are so demoralized that and or so isolated and sort of withdrawn into their own issues, often they come to me with a really high expectation that I'm somehow going to take on all of this stuff that they're dealing with and then bring them out of their dilemma. And I have to say that almost always is a failure. Those people rarely stick around very long. And part of it is I end up having to say to them in some ways, I'm working harder at this than you are. And so this issue of somebody's intrinsic capacity and motivation plays such a vital role. Regarding competency of therapists, though, I think it's a really important thing to consider. And I've, you know, unfortunately on this platform that I'm on, there's 25,000 therapists on my platform. And so many of the people I work with have worked with a couple of different people and had some pretty unpleasant stories about people just not having the skills or not showing the motivation to help them, or just disengagement with them. I think one of the most valuable and important things that stands out, not only in terms of intellectual competency, you want somebody who understands psychological and mental health principles and understands some of the techniques that can be beneficial to those people. But the issue of their capacity to really connect and really, you know, show sincere desire and motivation to be an advocate, a support, you know, a guide to that other person. That's where I feel like the rubber hits the road for me. When I start a session with somebody, you know, what I think about is I need to be 100% engaged in what this person's experiencing, what they're dealing with, and really listening very, very closely so that I can guide and echo back to them sort of what I'm hearing from them. One of the things I say to my clients is I said, I can only work with what you give me. And so you get to decide what you share with me, and I will follow your lead in terms of what we're going to work on and where we're going to go with this work. So that's a lot of what I think matters. I don't think you have to be a genius. I don't think you have to be, I don't even consider myself in some ways the most intellectually savvy clinician, but I am fairly good at making a connection and really showing a sincere interest in guiding and directing and supporting another person. So, and I think that goes a long way in terms of the process.
You know, I think what Ignacio brings up there is a really interesting paradox. You know, that in the one hand, we have so much access to opportunity, resources, and information, and yet at the same time, so many people seem to be struggling. And kind of going back to what Chris was talking about earlier, I see a similar paradox with social media. And, you know, although it might have been intended to help us connect deeper and more often, more frequently, it's actually, I think, had the opposite effect. And in some ways, I think people are feeling more isolated, more alone than ever before, and really craving connection, conversation, and community. And I wonder, Rick, you know, there's a book that's called Bowling Alone, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that book, but it talks a lot about the importance of those strong social networks. And I would be curious to know what you feel like the impact that COVID had on people's sense of isolation, whether that be physically, emotionally, socially, or otherwise, has had on people in general, and how that's played an effect as far as people's mental and emotional well-being.
COVID is a discussion point for a lot of the people I work with, and the impact and what in many ways is that person's failure to do a reset after COVID. That the way in which COVID played it out in many of the people's lives was they they disconnected from the social network that they would existed for them. And that now that we're out of it, they've not re-engaged with it. The way in which people are functioning now, that they haven't found their place with their group in any substantive way again. Or they moved for various reasons. There's all kinds of factors that kind of played into it. But again, that issue of I'm not the same person as I used to be. I don't have the same life I used to have. I'm disconnected. Even though I go out and do things today, I just don't have the same network of people really defining and helping me live my life. And I think that's a big issue. And I think it comes back to this other issue is social media plays a role in people not easily finding and reconnecting with other people. I have a lot of people who are looking for a new partner and wishing that they had a new partner, and the dynamic of how the dating apps work and fail to work for them is a major challenge and problem. And then the secondary ways in which, or the third ways in which they would try to, how am I going to find an available partner in this day and age, in this inner city that I live in, is very baffling and demoralizing for a lot of people. And some of that has to do with COVID, but I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that we have insulated ourselves in a lot of different ways, partly due to COVID, partly because of social media, and have not figured out how to reconnect. So I wish there was a good answer here. I struggle with some of my clients about, well, I don't want to use the dating apps anymore. What do I do? And, say, well, go get a dog and hang out at the dog park, or you find a hobby that you're interested in, and then you're going to find a like-minded partner potentially there, or volunteer. But that's kind of it. That's all I've got in terms of trying to help people move forward with that dynamic. It's a very challenging world we live in now due to these elements. So,
Rick, I think you just nailed the nail on the head there by saying that my motto 15 years ago was just do what I do, and that person's going to be doing what they do, and we're going to end up doing it together. And honestly, my last three relationships were always like that. And every time I decided I was going to go on a dating app, it never worked. And every time I reached out to somebody on social media, it never worked. But I met my fiance volunteering at a Thanksgiving dinner. I met more dates working out at the gym, just being me, doing my physical therapy and them doing their physical therapy. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, like, you want to meet tomorrow and we'll work out together? It's like you just said, it's do what you're doing and they're going to be doing what they're doing. You'll end up doing it together. And then you have common ground to work from there.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent way of stating it, Chris. Good. It's a good approach. And I think it is kind of the only thing we've got, when you think about it. And then what, I think you really, and then if you have to develop some new hobbies and find some new hobbies that you're interested in, and you'll find those like-minded people, just like you said. So,
it's one of those things, like, life is full of paradoxes. And I find that that's almost like, specifically when we're talking about dating apps and things like that, that I get the impression that it's almost like the paradox of choice. And that sometimes, like, it's, not a great thing if you have too many choices. It's like, and this is going to be a terrible analogy, so please forgive me here, people, but it's like if you've ever gone in to sit at a restaurant and you open it up and there's like 24 pages of menu items. It's like, how the heck am I going to pick just one? And sometimes the less choice or the less options you have, it makes your decision making almost a little bit easier. And that's one of these dynamics that we bump into when you've got thousands of people using these dating apps, that it's just easy to, whatever the kids are saying, swipe left or whatever these days. I don't know.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, one of the things that I'm interested in here, Rick, and that's the going back to the conversation of anxiety and depression. And I know that, just based on the little bit of research that I've done in preparation for this, that anxiety and depression are one of the most diagnosed mental and emotional kind of disorders or issues worldwide. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you feel the medication is an appropriate response to that? And to what extent do you feel like some of those things could be improved upon just by simple changes to lifestyle habits and things of that nature? And the reason I ask is because my own personal bias, and I could be wrong here, is that I get the impression sometimes that big pharma or the medical community is quick to prescribe medication without necessarily asking about or addressing some underlying lifestyle factors. But that's just my perspective, and I'd be curious to hear kind of what your opinion is on that.
Mhm, mhm. Well, there's no question in my mind that we are over medicated as a society, and it's about money to be made in diagnosing and over diagnosing the population to feed into this issue. And if you look at the data on how many billions that pharma makes, off of us, it keeps going up every single year. And us as a society, us a Western civilization, the U.S. in particular, and I think Canada is more similar than different, at least in this category, is that we are very quick to diagnose anxiety and depression, and the next step is a medication to move forward with that. And so that's very readily done. The way I typically talk about this, especially if people are not on a medication or have had a bad experience with a medication or ineffectiveness with medication, is that I really want to work with them around behavioral change. And what are the behavioral changes that you can make that will put you in a place where you're going to have more control over anxiety, for example, but also less symptoms of anxiety and certainly of depression. What are the external factors that are potentially driving you to experience life in this way? And I just started with a client yesterday who's got just significantly multiple stressors in his life, caring for a disabled adult child. Wife works a different schedule. They hardly ever see each other. He's got financial issues. He's currently developing some health issues. And then he started having panic attacks. And he's thinking, and so my statement to him is, your life situation is creating these panic attacks. And if we can figure out how to help you reduce some of the stress from this dynamic, you're very likely not to have a panic disorder. Now, on the other hand, some people develop a panic disorder or anxiety disorder simply by their biology. And so what I do is I work with people around, let's put in place some behavioral changes that you can implement, either environmental changes or systematic sort of behavioral changes that you would make around how you do this. Some certain thought stopping techniques, various ways to sort of reset yourself. Anxiety comes up for people who go to bed sometimes and their mind races. So changing the way they go to bed, changing the way they manage to that. And so work all of those behavioral pieces first to see whether we can get an impact. Now, what often happens is they get some impact, but it's insignificant or not notable enough. And then it's often the case that, okay, well, it may be best recommended that you experiment with medication to work with that issue. And so I will state that to folks as an action. Starting out very slow with very mild amounts. And I have to say, especially with anxiety, you can have some really amazing results with a fairly small dose of anxiety medication for certain kinds of situations. But again, I'm a big advocate for changing the way in which you're functioning and the way in which you're thinking about these things to move forward. Now, depression's a little bit different, especially if you're getting into situations where they have what you would call more of a clinical depression. So the biology of the brain has been altered in some way, or there's a genetic propensity for depression. Maybe family members have depression. And so you can certainly get into situations where behavioral change has no real notable effect. And the only good avenue is the proper medication. The challenge also for folks who are doing that is getting a medication to work effectively for depression can often take several different tries, and it takes several weeks in order to get a notable result. And so it requires a lot of patience and perseverance that some people are not willing to tolerate. And so, you know, there's a lot of sort of pros and cons around some of these pieces. And there are people who get a reset in some ways from a medication for depression. You know, you sort of reset the brain after a year of use. They can actually go off the medication in some cases and have a fairly positive effect. Although that's a little bit rare. It doesn't happen a lot, but it certainly can happen. So you know, I'm not opposed to it, absolutely, and I work hard to try to help people not do it if they can. But I think it's certainly an element that exists in society. So,
you know, you bring up a really interesting point there, and when you mentioned that this specific client that you were working with had some lifestyle, or not lifestyle, some obstacles or challenges, living circumstances that were creating some of that anxiety and some of that panic attacks. It reminded me of a very powerful awareness that I developed a number of years ago. And that's the sense that in the past, when I've struggled with stress, anxiety, fear, or worry, or things of that nature, my go-to response was typically to either want to run from it, or numb it, or distract myself from it, or avoid it at all costs. And what I learned was that oftentimes those emotions that we sometimes call like bad emotions, like stress or anxiety, are often our body's way of trying to tell us something. And the analogy that was shared with me was one that was very powerful and enlightening, and it's like the indicator lights on your car. You know, and if an indicator light comes on your car that suggests that you need an oil change or that your tire's flat, you know, most people probably wouldn't take electrical tape and try to cover up that indicator light. But that's what I was doing by drinking, by smoking, by doom scrolling, and, you know, doing all sorts of things to try to avoid feeling that way, rather than getting curious and asking myself, okay, well, what is the root cause of this, and where is this coming from, and how do I actually alleviate some of that? And that was a game changer for me. And I realized that there are probably, like you said, some biological and physiological reasons as to why some people might be experiencing like clinical depression. And so that's not necessarily across the board, but that was a huge, huge, huge awareness and aha moment for me when I realized that it's not really good or bad emotions. There's just emotions. And all they're trying to do is just communicate either where things might need some help or something that needs to be addressed, you know?
Yeah. I think your analogy was very well put too. I think it's a great example of the difference between, you know, what we're sort of conditioned to push away anything negative emotion, negative response, push it away, rather than it just recognize there's an array of emotions we're all going to experience. There's an array of experiences we're all going to have. Some of them are going to kind of suck, or some of them are difficult. And allowing ourselves to just recognize that and figure out how to sit with that is very valuable.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the biggest challenges that I experienced when I first was getting into sobriety, was this realization on a deep level that once I removed drugs and alcohol from my life, I didn't have very many other tools in my toolkit to help me deal with that. And what I actually had to do was now I had to deal with the emotions as they came up and find better, more positive, empowering solutions of working that through my system and addressing that and dealing with that. And that was, again, another one of those aha moments where it's like, oh man, that was a go-to for me. But Ignacio,
Ignacio's got his hand up.
Yeah, Ignacio, you have a question here.
Thanks. Such a fascinating conversation. I I wanted to ask, following up on this podcast that I listen to, I often hear statistics such as men tend to have the highest say depression levels or even suicidal levels if you compare to female. I don't know to what extent that is true or not. So I wanted to ask you basically, what are the similarities or differences between men and women mental health, and specifically now for men, what are the specific challenges that we face?
I don't know. I don't know if I know that statistic in terms of the comparative difference, and so I can't comment to the difference. I do know that there are different symptoms, notably different symptoms for women than for men, and in some ways you could argue that a lot of the symptoms for men are easily masked by variations on anger. You know, using anger and sort of deflection. That would keep you from sort of recognizing the significance of your overarching depression about life. I think there's a lot more sort of excuse making that men sort of make. Well, if I just had a better job, then I wouldn't be depressed. Or if my wife wasn't X, Y, and Z, then I wouldn't be depressed. And recognizing and not recognizing that changing the job or changing the wife, actually you're still depressed. You're using that as sort of an excuse. I think that the issue for women, there's a lot more of an emotional sort of response to depression that kind of comes up. You know, men have typically sort of a smaller array of emotions that they're willing to express in general, and women often will have a much more sort of emotionally sort of what you call dysregulating response to depression than men do. And I know there's a handful of other ones that have been researched out there, but I don't have a quick handle on that. I think there's some really compelling research on some of those differences, but I don't have that readily available at this time. So.
We have about 5 more minutes here before I want to be respectful of Rick's time here. But if anybody has any other final questions, feel free to unmute yourself or throw it in the chat. But I was going to ask you, while we've got you here, Rick, when it comes to anybody who might either be looking for more resources or struggling with some, anxiety or depression in general, are there any specific practices or anything that you would suggest that everybody start with, whether that's like sleep or exercise or community, or possibly some books or resources that you're familiar with that you have suggested to other patients of yours?
In general, I kind of almost used the list you just described for many people, but certainly I suggest mindfulness and meditation practices for people who are really struggling with any kinds of anxiety or depression, to see whether or not they can get any kind of notable change. And often you'll start to see, okay, I am getting a little bit of a response from this. We live in a pretty fast-paced environment, pretty fast-paced world, and so having people slow down and sort of start to internally sort of check in with themselves is a huge issue. And frequently I have people who are not taking good care of themselves. And so their eating habits, their exercise plan, those kinds of things can play a big role in terms of just general overarching satisfaction and feeling like you're doing something worthwhile. I do this sort of thing with a lot of my clients where I say, you really need to be doing things that make you feel good about yourself. Self-esteem is often a major factor. So do esteemable things so that at the end of the day, when you lay your head down on the bed, you can say, yeah, today really sucked in a whole bunch of different ways, but I did this and this and this. And those things are taking me into a new place in life. They're worthwhile, valuable things for me to do. And I'm trying to take care of myself in a new way. And so I really ask people to sort of have that kind of self-reflective process where you're doing something worthwhile. Because in truth, when I propose that to people, they don't have much that they can say at the end of each day that they're feeling good about. And so it's really as simple as put something on your agenda that you can say, I did something worthwhile. It's magical in its own sort of way. So
100%. You know, in fact, I just had a conversation with somebody yesterday where they asked me, what's the worst advice that you ever received? And I had to think about that for a moment. But the thought that came to mind was that just do whatever makes you happy. And I think that sometimes there's this general advice that's given to do what makes you happy. And I found personally that there's a very big difference between pleasure or like just general happiness in the moment and like joy and fulfillment. And pleasure is cheap and it's easy to come by, whether it's scrolling through social media or, like you had mentioned, looking at pornography or taking shots of whiskey or whatever that might be. And that sense of joy and fulfillment that comes from setting goals, making progress, and feeling like you're accomplishing something. It's that sense of pride that comes up when you're taking on and overcoming challenges. And when you feel like you're making progress and that you're doing something that's worthwhile, I think that that kind of thing can be very rewarding, in my opinion. But it's interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely critical. So
one last thought, just while we're thinking about it, and then I'll let you run, Rick. I was reminded of a podcast that I listened to a number of years ago that always stuck out with me. It really struck a chord, and it was with a guy, I believe they called him the bodybuilding guru. And that's not important, but he was a coach that helped people get into bodybuilding shape and trained for competition. And he said that for like the first like 2 months or something like that, when a new client would come to him, his only advice and the only thing that they started working with was getting quality sleep, going for a morning walk, and doing breath work and breathing exercises.
Oh.
And oftentimes people would complain and be like, look, I'm paying you all this money and you're telling me to go for a walk and to get quality sleep and do breathing. What the heck? And he's like, look, that's the foundation. You have to have that in place. And if you can't do the simple things and the basic things, there's no point in even talking about the top of the pyramid. And I think that not only does that apply for bodybuilding, because that sleep is so important, but I think that that is really great advice for life. And I know that personally speaking, when my sleep starts to go, everything goes. And just some of those simple things like going to bed early or going to bed on time and ensuring quality sleep are so foundational that it's allowed me to begin to look at some of those other areas of my life and make sure that those foundations are in place.
Well put, Matt. That's exactly right. Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, well, it's been
this very
an absolute honor and a pleasure to have you here, Rick. And also to the gentlemen who were able to join us today, Alex, Brett, Chris, Ignacio. It's great to see you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that and got as much out of that experience as I did. And I'm certainly looking forward to connecting with all you guys again soon. Cool.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Rick, appreciate your time. Ignacio, I got one comment for you, buddy. One thing I've learned with therapists is interview them. You will find a connection in interviewing your therapist to find who fits your style best. I've had multiple therapists over the years for different situations and problems, and I've interviewed every one of them and always got the best results.
Thank you for that.
I 100% agree with you. That's excellent advice.
Awesome, gentlemen. Well, it's been great to connect with all you guys today. And thanks so much for your time, Rick. I certainly appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah.